Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the Illinois State Water Survey, and today our webinar is entitled Well Care 101, What You Need to Know to Protect Your Family. So the private well class sponsors this program. That's our core program funded through the Rural Community Assistance Partnership and US EPA to provide help to well owners all over the country related to their stewardship of their private well. And this is not the actual class. This is a webinar that supports the class. The class materials themselves, which I'll talk about in a little bit, are 10 lessons that are emailed to you once a week for 10 weeks. And so if you haven't signed up for that, you probably should. And it's a good resource of information. Okay, so today, these webinars are worth CEU credit for sanitarians and environmental health professionals through NEHA. And we're also an accredited LEHP provider for the state of Illinois. So if you are on this webinar and would like the information, the certificate, the slide deck, all those things, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org after the webinar is over. I want to remind everybody, though, that NEHA has a 2-year credentialing cycle. And so if you just started your 2-year cycle on April 1st, and you take this webinar today, you won't be eligible to take this course, this particular webinar for credit again until 2 years down the road. And I've listed here in the bottom right corner all the previous times we've offered it in the last 2 years. And so if you're still in the credentialing cycle that includes any of those dates and you took this before, you won't be able to get credit for it. I'll also mention that though the core content is the same, so it's not worthwhile for CEUs or CEs, the material near the end is all of the questions you all asked in advance, and at least some of those will be different than they were on any of the previous webinars because they're based on your questions. And so that's a worthwhile piece to listen to or to go back and visit the recording for down the road. Okay. Again, this is part of a national program funded through RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. And again, these materials do follow our private well class program. It's just a small snippet of what is actually in the class lessons. And so it is being recorded today. You can go back and look at this webinar as well as all the others we've done, which we do a webinar every month and have for 6 or 7 years. And you can see all those online. You can also, during the webcast today, if something I've said or you think of a question that you didn't ask before, or when we get through the questions today, I didn't answer your question, we had 400 people registered, so we have a lot more questions than we can answer, but we'll answer a number of those, and many times they're the same questions, but we are taking your questions through the chat and question box that's in your GoToWebinar screen. So you can type in a question there. Jennifer Wilson's with us today. She's monitoring that as we go through, and we'll make a list of those on a shared document on Google Docs, and I'll pull that up at the end and we'll go through them. And we'll stay and answer questions as long as we have questions to answer. Okay. RCAP, so a little bit about RCAP. They're our partner in this. We're kind of the online part of the private well program that's funded by US EPA, and they're the boots on the ground. And there's RCAP's made up of 6 regions. I'm in Illinois, so we're part of the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership region. There are 5 staff, I believe, for Great Lakes in Illinois alone. And they do assessments on private wells, they help set up workshops, and it's the same way in every state. So whatever state you're in, especially if you're a professional that works with well owners, if you'd like to set up a workshop, RCAP folks are great partners. They'll advertise it, they'll provide speakers, they'll do all the logistics to work with you to reach as many well owners as we can. That's the idea. And they also provide a service. It's a well assessment. It's kind of like a sanitary survey for a private well, or a vulnerability assessment is probably a better definition, where an RCAP staff person will go to the individual's home, look at their well and gather all the information they can about the well, and then write up an assessment as far as if there's any vulnerabilities, what they could probably be doing better as a well owner, if there's an issue, and it covers a wide range of topics. and it's all free because it's funded through US EPA. And so if you need help reaching one of the regions, their phone numbers are listed here, and you can find it on any of our webinars. We have the same slide, but you can also reach out to me. I work with the 6 regional leads regularly, and we all bounce questions off each other. We all learn from each other, and between the 6 or 7 of us, I'd say we've seen about every type of well situation you can find. And every well is unique. If you've worked with them for very long, you find out that there's always a unique situation with anyone's well that sometimes makes you scratch your head, or at least you have to go rely on others to help find information. So as far as today, we're going to talk about the basics of well care and things that you can do to take care of your well. We also, again, as we received a lot of questions, we won't answer all those, but we're going to answer many. Jennifer Wilson's with us today. She's our communications lead for our private well program, as well as wateroperator.org, which is a program that we run to support small and rural water and wastewater systems. And Walt Kelly, who's the head of the groundwater section at the Water Survey, provided answers to some of the questions you all asked in advance. So quickly, a little about the Water Survey. Most folks, even in Illinois, don't know who we are. We're a sister agency to our state geological survey and natural history survey. So we do similar work, but it's all water related. The Water Survey was formed in Illinois, and we're the only one in the country by our state legislature in 1895 to investigate really cholera and typhoid outbreaks. And so we've been around a long time. We do a lot of applied research. We house the state's well logs. We have a public service lab that does well testing for well owners, and we answer people's questions. I've worked with well owners in Illinois for over 30 years, and sometimes just to help them understand if they're putting in a new well or if they have a water quality issue. That's our job. And so we're going through all of our old archives, and so I throw a couple of these pictures up every time, just because, one, I'm really proud to work at the survey. We do a lot of great work and we help a lot of people, but it's interesting how the water world evolved from 1895, when there were no treatment systems and there was no centralized wastewater treatment. And you can see this is Quincy, Illinois, I think. Yeah. And when they installed a filter plant for their water supply, they started seeing a lot fewer cases of typhoid. And we have diagrams like this for all over the state. This is my favorite one. This is an old glass plate slide. We have about 1,500 of these that date back to around 1900. And even though this slide is broken, you can see that this was an investigation of typhoid in Rockford, Illinois. And they went to the level of investigating the dairy route for this E. Erickson, who delivered milk, because in a number of cases, it ended up being the milk that was carrying the typhoid. And that's because, in the old days, back at this time period, you got your milk out of a large tank. Everyone used the same bucket. It wasn't sanitary, and it led to a number of communities that had typhoid outbreaks around this time. So it's cool that they went to this level of detail to try to determine at the time where the typhoid might be coming from. This is a town community well for just at a park in a small community, but you can see the tin cup sitting there and the Water Survey containers off to the left where we're taking a water sample. Everybody drank out of that tin cup for the whole town. And these days, even when I was a kid, many years ago, this wouldn't have been a big deal. But today, we obviously understand that you're taking a risk every time you do that, with water standing there and water and that old hand pump never being sanitized. And if you've seen a modern drill rig that does not look like this, there's a steamer off to the right that's pulling those belts to run the rig. This is Weldon, Illinois, and their community well that was put in 1922. So enough of that. What we're here today for is to talk about your well and well water, and if you're going to be the steward of your own water supply, what that means. So private wells aren't regulated around the country after they're installed. It's really up to the owner to make sure they're safe and that the folks drinking the water our drinking water that's safe, as well as maintaining the system. So you're doing all the things that a water system does. Like for my community water supply, we have licensed operators, they have engineers, they ensure that the water that when you turn on your tap in your home is safe to drink. That's your responsibility as a well owner. So it's not something to take lightly. And I will tell you that you may think, well, I've drank this water my whole life. I grew up on a farm on an old dug well. When I left for college and came back home 3 months later, all of a sudden I couldn't drink our well water anymore. It made me sick. And it's because I drank it my whole life and my stomach was used to those bacteria. I went to a community water supply for a while and I drank chlorinated water, and that changed basically the makeup of all the bugs in my stomach, so I couldn't drink it anymore. And the other thing to remember is that you can't go by taste or odor. Many things that are contaminants, like arsenic, have no taste, they're colorless, they're odorless. The only way to know if it's in your water is to test. And I use arsenic a lot. I've done a lot of arsenic research in Illinois. It's the 7th most common element in the Earth's crust. So you may have it. Some states have no arsenic issues whatsoever. Others have multiple aquifers where there's higher arsenic, and it's a concern, and you have to treat it if you're a public water supply, and you also need to treat it if you are a private well owner. So now today, I'm on a community water supply, as I mentioned, in Champaign-Urbana, and I say $40 or $50. I need to change this number. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and so all of a sudden our water bill is rarely under $60 a month. But that's the cost that everyone pays for 150,000 residents to cover all the costs it takes for infrastructure, running pipes, fixing main breaks, testing regularly, and having qualified staff to ensure that I have safe water to drink when I turn on my tap, and that there's always water pressure when I turn on my tap. Because all those things you take for granted. Again, growing up on a dug well on a farm in the middle of the country, when our power went out, we had to have a generator to run our well, as anyone would with an electric pump. We had to worry about our pipes freezing in the winter. It was a shallow dug well, and our pipes were at the surface, and so we had a small well house built over our well, and we kept a propane tank down there. So at 2 in the morning, sometimes we'd go down there to turn on that heater because otherwise our pipes would freeze and bust. So there's a lot to it, depending on the type of well you have and all those things. And I will say that the 2 biggest reasons for well problems that I've found and water quality problems are poor well construction. Whenever states started passing laws requiring specific well construction and it meet well code, and that's to ensure a safe well, all the wells that were already installed were grandfathered in. We still run across a lot of old dug wells or wells in pits, and so that poor construction allows surface contaminants to get in wells, and we see a lot of that today. And the other is really a lack of knowledge by well owners. A lot of folks come into a private well, they haven't been on that their whole life, they buy a home with a well, and if you don't understand how to take care of it, we run into a lot of problems where people just don't realize that it's a risk. My dad was that way. He assumed our well was always better than city water because it didn't have chemicals in it. Cities put chemicals in their water, and that's bad. Not understanding that our water was always contaminated. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks who've been to our house when I was a kid who drank our water and eventually had some intestinal issues. So well considerations, well depth, obviously generally deeper is better, but that's not always true. And the reason we say that is it depends on construction, but if you have a deeper well, then and it's the water getting in your well is from a greater depth, then it's further from the surface, and so it's less likely to have surface contaminants. But that's not always the case. Again, I mentioned things like arsenic or radon or uranium. There are natural occurring contaminants that are just part of our general makeup of our groundwater and our geology. And in those cases, you just need to understand that those natural contaminants might exist in your area. And there are folks in your state and your local area who will know the answer to that. Location on the landscape. The example I usually use is you buy this 5-acre property and it's got your house is up on this nice hill overlooking a small stream. Well, there's no water up on the hill. And so you have to put the well down near the stream, and the sand and gravel, shallow sand and gravels that were accompanying the stream. And so now your water's coming from an aquifer, but it's connected to a stream that obviously has surface contamination. And so understanding where your well's at, where it's getting the water from, as well as flow direction. And most of the time you're not going to know that, but if you have a fairly shallow well, the groundwater flow direction and the water table typically follows land surface elevation. And so if you're in this nice country subdivision that one end, where you enter the subdivision is near a river, and you drive up the hill towards your house, assume the water is flowing towards the river. You know, the river is a natural discharge for groundwater, especially shallow groundwater. And so knowing what's above you on the landscape, another home with a septic, for instance, matters as far as where your water's coming from. And then the area surrounding your well, if you're a farmer, are you using pesticides? Are you mixing with the well water? Do you have backflow devices? Are you storing chemicals nearby? Are there livestock? Is there a gas station nearby with buried tanks? There's all those things. Is there? I had someone call me the other day, and they were going to build a house. They bought property that had been an old landfill. And one, I don't think it's legal to put a well in over a landfill. But two, why would you? You don't know what's there, especially an older landfill that's been covered up and not utilized anymore. Before there were regulations, it could have anything in it. So it's really important that you understand those things. So as far as well construction, again, well construction codes have changed significantly over the past, this should probably say 50 plus years now, but existing wells were grandfathered in, so we still see wells in pits and hand dug wells. You know, the well I grew up on is still in existence, for instance. But as code changes, as we find out new things and learn more about what's safe and what isn't safe, and each state is its own. So Illinois passed their first well construction codes in 1968. In New York, it wasn't until 2000. And so any well drilled before 2000 in New York could have been drilled with someone who's not a licensed driller, using any type of material. They may not have grouted the outside of the well, which is putting a non-permeable material around the well casing so that things can't, from the surface, can't slide down the outside of the well and get to your, to the inside, basically. And so, you know, the problem with these old wells especially is they provide an opportunity for surface contamination, and they can be, in the case of a dug well or a pit, they can be a safety hazard. And, you know, here's some examples. These are all, you know, the picture on the upper left is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They are the state agency that regulates well construction and licenses drillers in Washington State. And they have a blog, and they have several blog posts about these situations happening. This piece of plywood, only half of it's there now. You can see it had a hole over it with a concrete block. But even when that piece of plywood was solid across, and before this woman stepped on it and it broke and it killed her, you can see this little well house. There's a funnel there, probably to put oil in the pump. There's a bunch of gray material on the ground. That's probably insulation from where it's old, and their mice have got in there and you know, eaten that up, and it's falling apart basically. So it's not a safe way to have your well. You don't know what's floating on top of that. If you look down, we had a better picture, those sort of things. This picture of the dead goat in the upper right, it's in southern Illinois, and you can see this well actually isn't in use anymore, which is a good thing, but it was an old stone-lined well, and they put a piece of concrete tile vertically in it, but it only stuck up about half a foot, and it wasn't covered. And so a goat got curious one day and fell in there, and that's where he ended up. But the picture on the bottom is from a sampling study we did of dug and bored wells in Illinois in agricultural areas looking at pesticides and nitrate. The house is up over the hill. You can see the barn and the bin there. These posts look all worn because this is a cattle pasture. So the cattle come up to this well, they're scratching, doing their business, And this is a shallow well that's only, I think it was 24 feet deep. And so you can imagine what's infiltrating in the shallow groundwater there and getting into that well. Just really, this is truly an out of sight, out of mind type of situation. If you had to look at that every day and you knew you were drinking water out of that, I think you'd find a way to do something about it. At least I hope you would. But that's what we have, and these are real situations. So what should you do with these? Try to bring them up to code. If you have an old well that that if it's in a pit, especially when those flood, most well caps, even though they're have a gasket and they're meant to be watertight, if they have a vent tube, or if that gasket's been there a long time, it's probably not watertight. And so when those pits flood, water seeps in and contaminates a well. You can bring those up to the surface, extend the pipe up, fill it in with clay grout around it. And a pitless, if you're not familiar, a pitless adapter, in cold climates where you have a frost line, instead of bringing the pipes from your well and your pump all the way up to the surface, you elbow them through the pipe at around 4 feet or so, or deeper if needed, and they run into your house from there. And that's there's an adapter that allows you to pull that pump out and those things, and it's not a permanent assembly, and it's called a pitless adapter. But before the pitless was invented in the 60s, a lot of wells were put in pits because if you had it extended to the surface, your pipes would freeze. And so, and now we've engineered a way out of that. So talk to your well authority, your county, health department, or a contractor, find out what you need to do or what you can do if you have a well like this, or you're worried about it not being sealed properly. And I'll talk about it later, but one way to find out if your well is susceptible to surface contamination is to test for coliform and nitrate. And I'll talk about that more as we go through today. Same thing with abandoned wells. We see a lot of old abandoned wells. Someone buys a nice farmhouse or a farm 5 acres out in the country. They decide they're going to build a new house and just put a new well in while they're at it. That's great because that old well probably may not be safe, but a lot of folks decide, oh, I'm going to keep that for my garden, or maybe we're going to get a few chickens or cows, and we want to use that well for that. They end up being abandoned there and not filled in. And like a well pit, they're a safety hazard. They're also a source of contamination. It's a direct conduit down to the water-bearing unit. Could be the aquifer or maybe just the water table. But if you have one of those wells, you should fill it in and properly abandon it using, most states have a code, and part of the well construction code is how to abandon a well. And if someone falls, someone's on your property, even if they're trespassing, and they happen to find your old abandoned well and fall in and it kills them, or they get injured, you're going to be responsible for it. And they're just really a risk. And that's not to speak of the folks who maybe see that as a nice dumping area. We've got this nice 3-foot diameter hole in the ground. Let's fill it up with old containers and anything else we don't want, that again, out of sight, out of mind. You may be contaminating an aquifer. If you throw a container down there that has a chemical and it does contaminate the aquifer and affects your neighbor's well, you might be liable in that case as well. It's just poor stewardship to do those things. Here's some examples of abandoned wells that have either killed people or certainly caused a problem. The one on the lower left, the Sheldon man falls 45 feet. That's again from the Washington State Department of Ecology, from their blog. This man walked away. He fell 45 feet into a well in his backyard that he didn't know was there, and walked away from it. Very lucky. And the picture above that is also from Washington State, and they're getting a horse that fell into a well. These things shouldn't happen. All these newspaper clippings are from the 90s. The third one down, if you're old enough, you remember Jessica McClure. It was covered live on CNN for over 24 hours, I believe, where they were trying to dig her out of a well, and she sang to her rescuers, and she was I think she was 3 years old, 18-month-old, it says here, and she survived and is a grown mother of 3 now. And that's it happens more than people realize, and these old wells really need to be sealed. So as far as basic well care, we certainly recommend you should use a licensed well driller or pump installer when you're doing anything to your well, just because they know how to deal with those things. Our class is based on folks taking care of the well themselves, pretty much. but you need to know what your limits are. There certainly are people who are qualified to take care of their own well, but there's a lot who aren't. And what we recommend is if you're unsure, you at least get advice and then find out, you're taking a risk with the health of your family. And so make sure you know what you're doing. If you're going to take care of the well yourself, you need to understand well construction code in your state. If you're going to do those things, we recommend if you open your well cap, then you should probably disinfect your well, shock chlorinate it, just to be safe, because anytime you open that lid, you could be introducing bacteria. And once they get started and form biofilms in your well, you're not ever going to get rid of them. And so, yeah, that's just as far as best practices. Be sure you know what you're doing if you're going to try to take care of it yourself. As I mentioned, every state has well construction code, but two, and that would be Pennsylvania and Alaska. Alaska's working on it, I know. In Pennsylvania, it's been a really frustrating thing for the folks in that state, especially professionals who believe they should have well construction code and they should license drillers to ensure they're qualified to drill a well, and they just haven't been able to get their state legislature to do that. And so you should look at the code. You can just Google it. If you Google Illinois well construction code, it's going to take you to the Illinois Department of Public Health's webpage, and you can see the whole thing online. And it's good to understand setbacks and all the different things that go on related to a well. Your well site itself, and I use this example just because it's a good, nice diagram of well. It's plenty high enough. You don't have to worry about flooding. If there's a torrential downpour and that's a little bit of a low spot, then you need to ensure that the well is properly sealed around the outside. The annulus is sealed and grouted. The one thing that's wrong with this picture is that the ground should slope up around the well, so anytime it does rain, it's actually running away from it. But these are the things that are important. If it has a vent, make sure there's a screen on it so that small critters and bugs can't get in it, or snakes, and those things do happen. And make sure it's elevated so that it isn't a flooding hazard. If water gets up to the top of that cap, it's bolted, and there should be a gasket. But again, especially if you're in a freezing climate, if you think about it, if your well's 20 years old, that means that gasket has gone through 20 years of extreme heat and freezing, and it's very likely it's brittle and cracked and not doing the work it was meant to do. And I know there's a new type of gasket these days. A driller mentioned to me a few weeks ago that's much more durable, but depending on how old your well is, you may have one of the older types of gaskets, and it's probably a best practice to replace that. The well should be accessible. And that means that, especially for a well that's got a submersible pump, a drill rig or a contractor's rig to pull the pump needs to be able to get over top of the well. And that may seem like common sense, but you see people who put trees right next to their well, or have their well build a building right next to it, or even inside it. We've ran across wells that are in garages, in basements, in kitchens, and these are typically older homes, but it still happens. And it's not allowed today in any state that has a well construction code, and it should just be obvious that a well you need to have access to it so that you can elevate, even with a rig with a tower, so no overhead lines, all those sorts of things. And you can inspect this wellhead this way, make sure that the ground is sloping up, or you can add dirt around it so that it slopes away, plant grass there. Don't tie a dog up to it or any of those things. We see those kind of problems as well. It's just, there's a lot of common sense here. Treat your well with respect, so to speak. It's expensive these days as a car. And so it's an investment you really need to protect and take care of, because, if something happens to your well and you have to put a new one in, you're probably talking at a minimum $10,000 later, if not in some states, like in California, it's probably over $40,000 or $50,000 for a new well. And that's not something most of us can just go out and do if we had that issue. I mentioned setbacks. This is an example from Minnesota. I end up using a lot of resources from Minnesota's health department because they're an exceptionally good, thorough, comprehensive health department that has a lot of resources for their well owners. And so every state has its own rules based on what these numbers might be. So for instance, for a petroleum tank in Minnesota, it has to be at least 50 feet away from the well. It may be 100 feet in your state or some other value. Hopefully there is an isolation distance or a setback, it's called, for a lot of these things. And I show this one because, again, it's pretty comprehensive. It's just meant to show you all the activities that could in some way affect your well. And, vertical heat exchanger, early on, for instance, they weren't using necessarily safe antifreeze in those. Now they use food grade, if that's what's being used in the to carry the heat and that stuff. But you can contaminate your own wells another pathway if that wasn't built soundly or all those sorts of things. Here's the bottom half of that diagram. And again, there's just a lot of things. Even, it has to be 3 feet from a building. It has to be 10 feet from an overhead line or a hydrant. All those sorts of things matter. And, these are minimums that are required by law for a lot of these things. A cesspool, for instance, or storage for manure, I'd probably want to put it further away if I had the option. So as far as septic systems, we're not a septic program per se, but obviously septic systems have a lot to do with private wells because most people on private wells also are on septic systems, not everyone. And some people have community water supply, but they still have a septic. So it's just, because they're dealing with wastewater and our waste and, a lot of bacteria, it's can be a source, just like a feedlot can be a source for coliform or E. coli, so can a septic system. And so understanding your septic system and drain field is important. This is a 2-compartment tank, so everything comes in from your home into the first compartment, and some of the stuff floats, it stays on top of the water, some of it sinks to the bottom, and it's those solids that eventually you have to pump out or your tank will fill up. And once it does, it can get clogged. It can eventually get out into the perforated pipe for the absorption field. And if that happens and those holes get plugged, then all of a sudden you have a plugged system and it won't work anymore. So it's really important to understand how this works and how to take care of it, including having it drained, or not drained, excuse me, having it pumped on a schedule that ensures it doesn't fill up with solids. So I know we got a question today about maintaining the area around your well. It's important not to have trees really close to a well or anything like that, but it's super important for your septic field, especially because it's a perforated pipe. You need to keep the area around your tank and drain field open. Just grass, no trees, no concrete, no asphalt. Anything that we see all the time where there's a tree close to a septic field and those roots are looking for water, so they're going to reach out and find the holes in that perforated pipe and clog up your drain field. And so it's probably one of the more common ways that a drain field fails. And so things you can do is, one, reduce the flow of water into your septic system. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't use your normal water use, but you shouldn't have your softener or your sump pump or your whirlpool drain into your septic. Septic tank works based on the bacteria in our bodies naturally breaking down the material that comes into the tank. So it's supposed to settle there, the bacteria work on it, and then the liquid flows off through the drain field and then percolates into the ground where more bacteria can work on it and break it down. It's a natural system. It works great just as it is. But if you're running too much water through it, the bacteria don't have time to do their job. And so it's better not to do that. I know at least in some states, you're not allowed to put your softener backwash. It's against the law to do that. And only put wastewater in your septic tank, which means in any of your sinks, your toilets, or anything. No man-made stuff, paint, pills. If you think about it, it's bacteria in your septic tank that are doing the work of breaking down all the material that comes in. If you're putting your leftover amoxicillin from when your child was sick into your toilet and dumping it, you're putting something that kills bacteria into your septic tank. and that's just not a good idea. And the other important thing is garbage disposals. Those solids, like from your vegetables and stuff like that, they're too intact, if you will, for the bacteria to be able to break them down in any measurable time. They end up in the solids in the bottom, and they get buried. And so if you have a garbage disposal, it's actually recommended that you don't if you don't have a septic system. But if you do, you should probably at least cut in half the time between pumping your tank. And yeah, and so you can inspect your tank to measure the amount of solids and get an idea for the number of people in your family and the size of your tank, how often it should be pumped. We actually do a webinar every July on septic systems that's a lot more detailed than what I'm going to go through today. I recommend you go back and watch that video if you have questions about your septic tank, because we answer a lot of the questions you might have. Okay. I do want to point out, if you're a septic owner, that you should know about septic, the septic page on US EPA's website. It's just epa.gov/septic. There's a ton of resources here that'll help you understand how to take care of your well. There's videos, there's just a wealth of information. Every year in September is Septic Smart Week. We participate in that with around 400 other groups, agencies, health departments, to make people aware of the things that are available. And again, there's a lot to go through here. If you're interested, you can find out a lot about what type of system you have, how it works. If you're a professional, there's an outreach kit. There's things you can provide when people ask you questions, like if you're from a health department. There's a lot of good information here that you can share with well owners that you help. And as far as drinking water, this is a good diagram. There's a page just on septic tanks and drinking water. Even if your water well, your drinking water well, is on the opposite side of the home and it meets a setback, again, here groundwater flow direction happens to be the other way. And so it's possible that the wastewater is treated through your drain field. If it gets into the water table or into an aquifer fast enough, that it's not broken down and it can affect your well. And so just understanding those issues and what can happen, the better job you do maintaining your system and doing things correctly. And that again includes testing annually for coliform and nitrate. You'll understand if there's a surface influence affecting your well. If you have an advanced system, which means it's either aerobic or it's nitrate removing, or there's a bunch of wastewater systems that aren't just septic tanks that are for private homes, they've got a lot of information on those technologies. There's a lot of different ones to mention. I won't today, but there are resources available to help you understand that. Some, basically don't discharge anything. You have to have them pumped in vulnerable aquifers, for instance. So yeah, there's a lot to know, and the rules are changing. There's a lot to do about, especially discharging your septic. We still run into folks who have a straight pipe into a farm field, into a drain tile, or straight into a stream or a ditch. That's illegal, and you're affecting the ecology, could be contaminating other sources. It's important to do things the right way and be a good steward, because you might be affecting your neighbor or even land use in some areas. And again, I mentioned there's a ton of webcasts that they have available. There's a page just for that. You can look at those. And if there's something that you're interested in, even home financing, USDA rural development, the second one there, USDA through the rural development program has funding for some low-income folks to replace septic or wells or add treatment. We've also done a webinar on financing. I'll mention that, where we had these folks speak at our webinar and include what options there might be for you. So as far as testing, that's really just like the questions that we went through for today. A lot of questions about testing and sampling and contaminants. You should test your well annually, as well as anytime you've opened it, or if there's anything noticeable in a change in taste, color, odor, something just doesn't seem right, you should test your water. And it's an expense for being a well owner. I know, a good water test, a complete test of inorganics, metals, and bacteria, may be upwards of $200. Um, but it's important to understand your water quality, and we'll talk more about that as we move through here. So what do you test for? You know, it really depends on the type of well you have, what formation is coming from, meaning the geologic formation. And some of these are questions, it's like, and I'll show you examples where you may have a unique contaminant that's natural in the groundwater in your area that other people might not have. And so you need to ask questions. Talk to your local health district or county health department, um, you know, your extension person, or even your well driller or contractor. They may be able to help you and understand if there's anything locally known. You know, for instance, I always use the example, Tazewell County in Illinois has high arsenic in the sand and gravel aquifer. That's, you know, it's pretty extensive and it's used a lot there. The Tazewell County Health Department certainly understands that there's arsenic in the aquifer there, and they get a ton of questions about it. So they're a good resource if you're in Tazewell County to contact your health department, and they can tell you a lot about it. And I know that mainly because I've done a lot of work over there myself, but it's naturally occurring. There's nothing causing it that's not man-made in any way, and it's just the way it is. And that's just like some folks have oil under their ground and others don't. Your water quality is dependent on the geology, and it's just the way it is. So once you talk to your neighbors, even the state records folks. So like here, that'd be the State Water Survey, State Geological Survey, but even those folks may have an idea of water quality issues. But your state resource agency and your state primacy agency that regulates community water supplies, so your drinking water agency in your state, in Michigan, that's Eagle. In Wisconsin, that's DNR. In New York, it's Department of Health. It just depends. But if you look up, you know, your state two initials, drinking water agency, it should come up. They're already regulating all of the community water supplies. And so they have an idea of what natural occurring contaminants those communities are already dealing with. And so they'll know in your area because you're not that far from another community water supply in most cases, that there wouldn't be information available. And in some states, you can even look that stuff up. I know some states put all of their drinking water compliance data online. In Illinois, it's called Drinking Water Watch. Anybody, it's an open site, can go there and search their community and find out if they've had any violations, what contaminants those were, and look at their water quality of their samples that they've collected. So you can do your own homework and find out a lot of information. And then lastly, sample for coliform and nitrate annually. They indicate a pathway to your well. Okay, so one of the biggest confusions is everyone recommends, you know, every health department, every professional recommends you should test for bacteria and nitrate annually. Some people think that means if you don't have those things, your well is safe. That's not what it means. The reason you test for coliform and nitrate is because if you have coliform bacteria, it's likely a surface source. If you have high nitrates, it's likely a surface source. And what it really means is that your well is not protected from surface contamination. And that's a big thing to understand. So if you have, you know, say we have wells in our county here that are maybe close to 250 to 300 feet deep. They're sand and gravel. So the water's coming from the screen at the bottom of the well. And so water has to go 250 feet through the other geologic layers to get to the well screen to get in the well. So there should not be any bacteria or nitrate or elevated nitrate, I should say, in those wells. And if you do, that means there's a breach in your casing, the annulus isn't grouted properly, or there's some other reason. But if you have a shallow well and you're close to a source like your septic or a feedlot or whatever, then you know that your well's susceptible to surface contamination. But you could still have things like arsenic, which is a natural occurring thing. You haven't tested for that. You don't know if you had it. I had a well owner in Macon County, Illinois, contact me. You know, we're not a state regulatory agency. We're part of the University of Illinois, and we do conduct research and do public service. She was mad. She bought a house. They tested for coliform and nitrate. They thought it was safe. I have 5 kids. A couple years later, there was a article in the newspaper about elevated nitrate in the aquifer in that area. So they sampled and they found their arsenic was 250 parts per billion, which the limit for a community water supply is 10. So it's 25 times the allowed limit for a public water supply. And she wanted to know why no one told her that. And so what I tell every well owner is it's buyer beware. If you're buying a home, you should always test the well before you buy the property. And two, you need to be diligent and sample your well regularly so that you can ensure for yourself and your family that your water is safe. And so, yeah, she blamed me, which unfortunately I explained to her that it's a state legislature thing. And, you know, it was unlikely that we would ever have laws for private wells in Illinois. And that's the case through most of the country. You know, you aren't required to meet 10 parts per billion for your well, even though that's the national standard for a community water supply, because there are no rules for private wells. And so you're on your own to enforce that and make sure your wells are safe. I run into people again in Tazewell County who said, I've drank this water for 40 years, even though it's elevated nitrate. It's, you know, obviously it's not going to affect me. Well, one, it's a lifelong issue and it can cause cancer, and it may affect, you know, it's just not worth the risk. We know it causes cancer, so you should not have it in your well, or you should eliminate it from your water before you drink it. So a couple examples. If you're in Massachusetts, they have a lot of arsenic and uranium in their bedrock there. So the state has done a lot of mapping to understand where that's at and a lot of sampling. And so now DEP has a website where you can go in and type in your address, and they'll tell you whether you are at risk for high arsenic or high uranium or both. And so it's a great service for the people in Massachusetts, especially, you know, there's just a lot of private wells throughout Massachusetts. And so, and there's also materials that they provide for folks in their state that are on the upper right there. And so that's one example of how you can find information online. And the reason you need to go do that is this is a great example from Rhode Island. So Rhode Island's a very small state. It's as small as some of the counties in Illinois. It's about 30 by 40 miles. But you can see here all these little dots all over. Those are where they know there's high arsenic in the soil, because until the 60s, arsenic was used as a pesticide for orchards, and there are a lot of orchards in that area of the country. And so now they know a lot of that's migrated into the shallow groundwater. And so if you're near an old orchard, they put this map up and recommend you test for arsenic. The big splotch in the middle, though, that's where there's elevated beryllium in groundwater. When I first found this, it's probably been 9 or 10 years ago now, I had no idea that beryllium was even a regulated contaminant, but it is. Community water supplies have to keep the beryllium below a certain level because it has health effects, and it can cause health issues in people who drink it if it's elevated. But I'd never heard of it, because I've done most of my work in Illinois until 9 or 10 years ago. And so it's a great example of why you need to be an investigator on your own and find out what other issues might be local to your area. Because if you're in this part of Rhode Island, you should test for beryllium. And that's just doing your due diligence. And that's why I show that example. Some states are developing better tools. So this is from Wisconsin DNR, which again regulates well drillers, well construction, and community water supplies. And they had the Watershed Science and Education Center at Stevens Point University in Wisconsin developed this online tool. I logged on. I told it I wanted to look at arsenic by county, and it shows me all the sampling results for private wells that they have. Some of the counties are blank. And again, this particular slide is probably 5 years old. I was just on this site a month ago or so, and there are no clear values anymore. Every county has wells that have been tested for arsenic, so they're all either green or some shade of red or yellow. But what this shows you is near Green Bay, there are 3 counties where the average sample that they've collected or that's been ran through their lab is over 20, which the health standard again is 10. And so if I live in Champaign, Illinois, if I was going to move to the Green Bay area and I wanted to buy a house with a private well, I would definitely sample it first and find out if, hopefully if there's high arsenic, the current homeowner already has arsenic treatment on the system But then again, you don't want to buy a home that's high in arsenic if you're not going to treat it, which you would have to do in these cases if you want to be safe. So there's a lot of valuable information online. Every state has different resources, and so you need to look and see what you can find. And we can also help you if it's the deal is I'm not going to know what the issues are in LeClaire County, Wisconsin necessarily. I can look it up and find some stuff probably, but you're better off reaching out to a local source, and so we can help you find those folks. So here's what we recommend. Again, this is for a national audience. So it doesn't include any of those things like beryllium, which we would not recommend that people test for all over the country because it's just not that common. But again, annually for coliform and nitrate for the reasons I mentioned before. But then this list of constituents, which is really inorganics and metals, and they give you a good overview of the chemistry of the water. If you have copper piping, you should test for copper. Zinc and cadmium, if you have galvanized pipes, certainly older homes may have galvanized pipes, and those have lead in them as well, but lead's one of the things we recommend you test for. And then again, don't just go with our list. You should ask your local or state health department or district what they recommend. Maybe there's other things they've seen before that are a concern, and I would go with that route when you decide what to test for. And we say every 3 to 5 years. The best example I can give you is if it's a deeper aquifer. The aquifer I mentioned before is called the Mahomet. It's a little over 200 feet below land surface. It recharges slowly, so the water chemistry doesn't change dramatically. And so I have some monitoring wells out in the Mahomet aquifer where several of them are high in arsenic, 40 or 50 parts per billion, but there's one that is around 3. And I always find that strange, but it's based on the source geology, and right at that location it's just a little different, and so it's lower. But I sample that well every 10 years, and it's been there since 92. Yeah, and the arsenic's always low there, and it's always higher in the other ones, and it's always close to the same value. And so if you sample for all of these things and there's a sudden change, all of a sudden, the alkalinity is different or the arsenic's different or whatever, then you need to try to figure out why, because it shouldn't change a whole lot. pH of the aquifer shouldn't change. And if you sample a well today and it's, the pH is 7.4, and you sample again in, 5 years later and it's, 5.6, there's something going on. You have a hole in a pipe, something's causing that. The chemistry shouldn't change like that. And that's the other reason why, just testing once and forgetting it isn't necessarily the best thing to do. Just, that's what we recommend, just so you have a handle on what your water quality might be. And it could be that what you sampled for, today, 5 years from now, we've discovered some other thing that might be worse. A good example of that is manganese. Manganese is currently considered a secondary contaminant, which means it causes taste, odor, staining, those type of issues like iron does. But now there's evidence that it causes neurological effects, especially in children. And so the EPA is now looking into that. And my guess is in 4 to 6 years, it will be regulated as a primary health-based contaminant. And there'll be limits set that aren't for taste or odor or color or staining or whatever. But because we're trying to protect public health. And so it's always a good idea to have that information available. Yeah. As far as where to get it analyzed, every state accredits labs. So when I say accredited, that means they've been certified that they can do compliance sampling, which are the samples that communities have to do every 3 months to remain in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so, again, I'll talk about that a little more at the end. One of the questions was about that. And some states actually have programs for private well sampling. You just need to contact your primacy agency, which is what I call it, your drinking water agency in your state, to find out if they may have that available. A good example is in Iowa. They have their state legislature set up a program called the Grants to Counties program. and they provide funds to the county health departments either to subsidize sampling or to help subsidize the cost of abandoning wells. So it's used for public good. It's good to help people understand. And if you're in Iowa, that's a program you should take advantage of. But when you reach out to a lab and you talk to a lab, they should be able to give you all the detailed instructions, explain what you need to do to preserve the sample or store it. Usually you're not preserving with acid these days. That's too much of a risk to give to just the general public. But you'll store it in ice, whatever they may tell you to do, and how quickly you need to get the samples back after collection. Because some things have a time limit before they're considered invalid, or it may affect the accuracy of your results. So, and they should be able to answer your questions. And I tell people, if you talk to a lab and they can't answer your questions, I'd go find another lab, because they should have people on staff that'll help you as a well owner understand the need for sampling and those things. But the lab should also provide the bottles and everything you need in order to get your sample collected and taken care of. As far as interpreting results, like it says here, there are websites, and I'm going to show you one that you can use online to get a sense of your results, but I would always take them to a qualified health professional, either your local health district or department, or your doctor. And I say that knowing that we just talked to a pediatrician recently who, a lot of doctors don't look at, well, I won't say it that way. A lot of doctors are unclear on all the issues related to private well water. And so sometimes it's difficult for them to answer those questions. In the same way with health departments. Not everyone has the knowledge they need to understand what all the chemistry results actually mean, but they should be able to find someone else who can. And just like, we do that. I mentioned, I know or later in one of the questions, someone said something about their water quality. If you send us your sample results, I work with a lot of folks who can look at that and give you a better answer, a good answer, if you haven't been able to get one. Just because, we run into all kinds of situations around the country where there's odd things in water or chemistry doesn't match up or whatever. So, another best practice is to sample, to resample. If you find something in your well, especially something that's totally out of place, if you talk to your local health professionals and they're like, we've never seen this before, it might be worth just collecting another sample for that constituent, because it could just be that the lab made an error, or there was an error in the way you collected the sample. I mean, who knows? Things like that can happen. And then usually you sample for coliform. And if you do find coliform, then if you didn't already do an E. coli test, coliform bacteria isn't harmful. It's an indicator bacteria. But if you have coliform, it means you could have E. coli, and that is harmful and can cause health issues. And if it's a bacteria problem, then you should boil your water that you use for drinking or cooking until you can shock chlorinate your well, and you've tested again and make sure it's safe. So the program I'm going to show you, the site I'm going to show you, is called the Be Well Informed Guide from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. So they got a grant from CDC to develop this tool that allows you to enter your sampling results. And then it's really cool in that it also tells you what kind of treatment you might need, and it tells you if it's over the health limit, and they provide a lot of beneficial information. And it's from a state agency, so it's someone who is trying to protect your health, not necessarily a vendor or someone who's trying to sell you equipment. And so in this case, what I did is I clicked on the bottom where it says enter your water test results, and I put in a value for arsenic. I will say that what it asks you to do at the top, it asks you to put your New Hampshire town or city. That's because they're trying to gather data about samples that have been collected in their state, so they have a better idea of where the issues are. But anyone can use this, honestly. You can put in anonymous if you don't want to share. And so, I put in 15, didn't put in anything else for any of the other constituents they list here. The cool thing is it has a drop down for the units. There are several of these tools that are available that have been around for a long time, but they require you to convert from milligrams per liter or from whatever unit the lab gave you to milligrams per liter. And you can see there's really 4 listed here: milligrams per liter, micrograms per liter, parts per million, parts per billion. and the lab may report in one of those units, and then you have to convert it. And if you're not comfortable doing that, or it's, we ask a question on a pretest for our class, we ask people to convert from one to another. Only 27% of the people who've taken our class, and there's been over 10,000, got that question right. And so this is an advantage in my book, because you can just click on the drop down and pick what units your lab gave you, rather than trying to convert it yourself. So in the end, arsenic 15 micrograms per liter is 0.015 milligrams per liter, which is how the standard's based, which is over 0.01 milligrams per liter, which is 10 micrograms per liter. And so because it's over 10 ppb or micrograms per liter, it's considered over a health limit. Now again, there's no law that requires you to meet the health limit as a private well owner. You're on your own, but it tells you that it's not considered safe for a community water supply. And typically, we use the EPA limits for community water supplies as a surrogate for what we consider safe for a private well. We should, the way I look at it is, it shouldn't matter whether you're on a private well or on a community water supply. We should all be equally protected from contamination issues or the threat of an adverse health effect. And so if we follow those guidelines, we're following the same information and rules, basically, that communities have to follow. It also gives you recommended treatment, and in this case there's two. A point of use arsenic absorption media system, which would go on your kitchen tap, or an RO unit, which would also go probably under your sink. And point of use, that's because in this case with arsenic's not a dermal or an inhalation risk, so you can shower in it, bathe in it, you just shouldn't drink it. And so there's no point in installing a system for your entire house. It'd be really expensive, and it would be a huge waste of water, and you'd have all that, all the arsenic that's left whenever you change that out and do the maintenance on it, you'd have to deal with. And so, and that's the case for most things. There's very few things that are actually a dermal risk or an inhalation risk. And so most of the time you're going to look at a POU unit rather than a POE, which stands for point of entry, which is whole house. A good example of a point of entry would be your softener, which you're softening all the water in your home, or a filter before your softener if you have, metals that are precipitating out and things like that. So, and you can follow down the page, there's more information. It talks about treatment options down here. How can I reduce the level of arsenic in my water? It talks about NSF ANSI standard 53 for absorptive media and NSF ANSI standard 58 for RO, reverse osmosis. Those things, so treatment equipment are certified by third-party certifiers. So like on your light bulbs, there used to be a UL, or on your appliances in your kitchen, there's a UL. That stands for Underwriters Laboratory. So there's certifiers. UL is one. The Water Quality Association has a gold seal. They're a second. And NSF, the National Sanitation Foundation, is a third. So it needs to have, if you're going to buy a treatment device, if you have a constituent you need to treat, make sure it has one of those symbols on it. If it hasn't been certified, then it's not guaranteed to work like they claim it will. And if it is certified, then you have, that means they went to the trouble of submitting it to UL or NSF or WQA, and they've tested it and they've ensured that it removes what it's supposed to. And so what I always tell folks, if you're going to buy treatment equipment, make sure that it's certified for the constituents you're trying to treat. And in some cases, like if you look for arsenic treatment or even RO systems, you'll see they'll range from $100 to $1,000. I guarantee you the half that are in the 500 to 1,000 range have all been certified, and many or all that are below that are not certified to remove that constituent. And so it's up to you, but you might be buying a nice pretty box that doesn't actually do anything that you want it to do. And and it just gives you some certainty that you're getting equipment that's going to work the way it's supposed to. So again, going back to interpreting results, the thing I just showed you is really just a tool and a guide. So you should take them to a qualified health professional to get an answer and make sure, their job is to protect your health and make sure your water is safe to drink. So you should lean on them. And if they can't answer you, they can find someone who can, or you can share it with us. I'm not a drinking water professional or a health professional either, but I know a bunch that are. And so we can certainly get you some qualified advice. And the thing about it, again, it's not against the law to have a constituent in your water as a private well owner that's above a certain health limit. It's just not a great thing to do. And I say here, they can't condemn your well. Now, I've learned in a very few health districts in out east, in the Northeast, some where they have basically home rule, and they can make their own rules and pass their own health district-wide rules. There may be a few health districts that actually can condemn your well, but most of the country and most health districts, most states, no one can condemn your well. You're free to drink it, whether it's contaminated or not. And if you're concerned about that, you can always call your local health district and ask them what their rules are. And it's not. I've even recommended to people, well, if your health district might condemn your well if you show them the results, and you're not interested in doing that unless it's your decision, you can always call a different health district that likely will not have that authority. Just remember, they're trying to protect your public health, though. So if they want to condemn your well, there's a good reason for it. So, and just like, in Tazewell County, I sampled a bunch of wells, and we had some as high as 200 parts per billion. And, people with 4 or 5 kids and all those sorts of things. And, we certainly recommend they add treatment, but it's really up to them to decide if they want to do that or not. And again, it's a problem because with arsenic, you can't see it, taste it, or smell it. And so it just doesn't come across as such a threat for that reason. Reasons for treatment. Again, health effects, cosmetic issues, or taste. Don't assume, just test. And again, don't necessarily treat without testing. And you really, there's no reason to add treatment to your system. There's plenty of areas in the country where groundwater is perfectly safe as is. So, you can be worried about it, and you hear all these stories, and you decide you're going to add $2,000 or $3,000 worth of treatment that you have to maintain. If you haven't spent the money on a test to find out what's in your water, that could be a complete waste of money. And I've seen it a bunch of times. And so you can't assume, you need to test. You need to know what your treatment system does and does not treat. We have people who put in an RO system, or if someone sells them a, quote, home purification system. If you don't know what it does and doesn't do and what it treats and doesn't treat, you're not sure what you have. And it's best that you have that knowledge, not just assume that the person who has a vested interest in selling you all that equipment has doing things for the right reasons. So you need to understand your treatment. And that goes with whole house purification as well. We run across a number of people who have whole house treatment, and I ask them why, and they say, well, that's the best thing for us to do. Well, if you're whole house treating for arsenic, you've wasted a lot of money, and someone sold you something they didn't have your interests at heart, because it's not a dermal issue, it's not your skin issue, it's not a breathing issue, it's a drinking water issue, and it's an ingestion issue. And so there's really no reason to have an whole house unit for arsenic removal, as an example. I guess I got ahead of myself. So there are very few cases, as I said, where you'd recommend whole house treatment, unless it's a skin or breathing issue. There are certain things where that is the case. Common examples for whole house treatment would be like your iron filter to keep iron from staining any of your sinks, or a softener to make sure all your water's soft that you're using wherever. But RO, again, you don't need it for that. And so be sure you become knowledgeable of those things and are asking the right questions before you waste a lot of time. And especially with RO, an RO unit wastes 4 gallons of water for every gallon it actually treats that you're drinking. And so if you're in an area where you have not a lot of water available, or you have a low yield well, you're wasting a lot of water for potentially no positive benefit. And the main thing is if you have any kind of treatment, whatever it might be, you have to maintain it and replace whatever's supposed to be replaced, a cartridge or a filter, on this recommended schedule, and you have to be strict about following it. So I mentioned Minnesota Department of Health a few times. One of their field guys, they have 7 regional field people who help private well owners in their region of the state. Whenever we first started this class, 8 years ago, he said, I wouldn't include anything about treatment in your program. And I said, well, why not? And he said, because I find more treatment devices that aren't maintained that become the source of bacteria or some other source of contamination than I do systems that are being properly maintained. And so a lot of times we remove the treatment and their problem goes away. So obviously I chose not to do that. And we do have, our last lesson is on treatment, but the take home message is, if you're going to add treatment, you need to be in it to maintain it and do what you're supposed to do. Because as soon as you let that go and relax about maintaining your system, you may be causing other health issues for your family. And so, yeah, it's probably the most important thing if you have treatment, is to make sure you take care of it. So a little bit about the private well class. This is the front page. It's just privatewellclass.org. And you can click on take our free class. It takes you to a page where you can sign up. That's this page. And we ask where you live. It's just by state, so that we, because we're grant funded through RCAP and US EPA, we have to provide them data that shows that we're reaching well owners all over the country. And we do. We have actually people from 10 or 12 different countries who've taken our lessons and told us about it. But everyone that signs up for the class, we ask them just to tell us your email address. That's how we deliver it. And then your first name and where you live. And that's a drop down by state. So yeah, it sends you one lesson a week every week for 10 weeks. For each lesson, also on our webpage under the resource library, is a set of other materials that we've found to be useful related to that lesson. So like the first lesson is called The Science of Groundwater. It walks through how water moves through the ground, the hydrologic cycle, basics of geology and groundwater hydrology. They're things that we think you need to know if you're a well owner, so you can understand where your water's coming from, how water gets in your well, how your wells get contaminated for the second lesson. And these resources, you can click on any one of them. They're free and publicly available from the folks that are listed here, are useful to help you understand more about each of these topics. We do webinars like this one every month. And this is a groundwater and well construction 101. This is an older slide, but because we just did this 2 or 3 months ago. But we have, each one is available on our website and on YouTube. We've done this twice. This is the last one, I believe, on funding and financing. Talks about all the different options, not just for a new well, but for treatment, septic, abandoning wells, a lot of different things. Yeah, and where those sources might be. The truth is, because private wells are all privately owned, and few states have programs to really fund or finance those things. There's the biggest program is through USDA, and it's for low-income folks. You have to meet certain income criteria, but there are a lot of groups that do things, especially with septic or abandoning wells. I know in Illinois, some of the saltwater conservation districts have a program. Well, they'll cost share 50% of the cost of abandoning an old well. Typically, at least in rural Illinois, that might cost close to $1,000, and so they're going to pay half of that for you. And it's, again, it's being a good steward of groundwater and water quality in your family's well to take care of those things. We've done a couple specialty ones. This one's on lead. We have a lead page. If you're interested in issues with lead, this is specifically for well owners. So, all the issues with Flint or all the legislation that recently passed to provide money for replacing lead service lines, those are all about community water supplies. Those are the lines that run to people's homes. It doesn't deal with the lead that you might have in your pipes in your house. That's your responsibility. And so this webinar really focuses on those issues and the plumbing materials in your home. You could have, in some states, they may have galvanized drop pipe, which galvanized pipe also contains lead. But all those things are discussed in this webinar, and I encourage you to watch that. And we also have a page, I'm not sure if I included it here, but it's just privatewellclass.org/lead, and it's a page to a bunch of resources. I mentioned we do a septic webinar every July. We have a septic expert from Massachusetts. They have some of the better rules and work done in Massachusetts related to septic systems, trying to protect their water quality. And so all the questions that are answered at the end of that webinar aren't by me, but by Jim Starbird, who is a Massachusetts, was a sanitarian there for 8 years and works a lot with well owners and septic owners there. We have a series of short videos that are on things like why my well keeps losing pressure, what is a sand and gravel well, what do I do after a flood, stuff like that. Ironically, a similar video to this one on how does my pressure tank work is by far the most popular. These were put up in 2016, and it's had well over 400,000 views. That tells us that a lot of private well owners have issues with their pressure not being correct, and so they have low water pressure in their home, and they're concerned about that. So this explains how that works, what your pressure switch is, why you need to set it at the right level depending on the number of stories in your home, some of those things. So really, it's all about being aware, and what we want well owners to know when they're done with our class is if they've been able to find their well log to understand what's on it, know where your water's coming from, how deep your well is, where your pump set, if it's submersible, do you have a well screen or not? Is it a sand and gravel well, or is it a bedrock well, or is it a dug large diameter well, and what that means. Know if there's any naturally occurring contaminants or what kind of water quality issues might be associated with your water source based on where you live, what's close to you, all those things. And then hopefully you'll learn enough about how wells work and your own situation that when you do have an issue, you're asking better questions or in the right questions. And because a lot of times, it's about you trying to understand more about your water source. And it's really worth your time to do so if you plan to live in that home. And that's, raise your children there and everything else. And then lastly, sample your well. There's, sampling in your home. And I'll talk a little bit about where to sample because it's interesting. If you sample from an outside spigot, you're getting water directly from the well. If you sample at your kitchen tap, you're getting water that's been through any kind of treatment you might have, even a filter or a softener. But even going through your pipes and sitting in your pipes overnight could change the water chemistry. And so it's important to understand where you're testing and what that might mean. And again, the goal of our class really is to help you as a well owner understand that it's really an important thing for you to understand. You need to know how your well works and what you can do to protect yourself from risk. So, and I said many of the 40 plus questions, I forgot to change the slide. There were 400 people registered. I know there's well over 100 questions today. But there are a bunch of the questions, I guess that's the point here, are answered in the class lessons. And so I don't answer those questions on this webinar because you really should take the class if you haven't and gone through it. And if you're a professional, you can take the class through NEHA. They have it on their e-learning platform, and it's actually worth a CEU for each of the 10 lessons, or a 1 hour credit. And so we certainly recommend you sign up there and not on our website if you can use NEHA credits at all as part of your license. So we're going to get to the questions now. Like I said, there was a bunch. Jennifer's taking your questions as we go through. Looks like we do have a few already, but I'm going to go through these first. And so first question, we are new to well water. Can we drink it just with a fridge filter or just out of the tap? Some say yes, some say no. Well, as I hope you've already understood from the webinar, the answer is to test first. If you don't test, you don't know what your water quality is. You may not need anything, and your fridge filter may help. You need to understand what your filter is actually removing. It may be that you have a constituent that your fridge filter doesn't affect, and you may need some other kind of treatment. Or you may want to add treatment that'll help your filter last longer in your fridge. We trust our community water supply, and now that I'm on city water, we have one of those fridges that has a filter. We use it, and that's where our ice comes from. I use it for ice, but I still mix tea in a pitcher, and I use our tap water. Everyone should have that confidence that their water supply is safe. So again, you are the water supplier. You need to test first, and then find out what that means. And if you do need to treat it and add whatever kind of treatment you might need. And so really, it may be yes, it may be no. It depends on what the results of your sampling are. And I apologize because there's an emergency vehicle going by, if you can hear that. Okay, so how often does well rehabilitation need to occur, and what are the signs it needs to be done? So typically, you don't need to rehab your well. It doesn't happen a lot. If you start having issues though, usually it's a water quantity problem where all of a sudden you're not getting the amount of water you need, or your pump's struggling. It typically, if that happens, your water levels have changed, it's one of two things. Either there's something happening to plug the well, and if it's a screen, like a sand and gravel well has a well screen, it could be that it's got some kind of scale or mineral buildup on the screen, and that's limiting the capacity. But typically, if you have problems with your well, it means you're going to need a deeper well, or there's some other issue that's going to require a new well. It just doesn't happen that often that it's a rehab situation, but it could be. Again, if there's scale buildup or some of the sediment buildup in the bottom of your well, that could plug your screen, or you start pumping material that's coming up with your well water. Or if it's a low yielding well, in bedrock, it's possible to frack it, which is basically opening fractures in the bedrock to increase water availability. Water well fracking has been going on for probably 80 to 100 years. It's different than the oil and gas fracking that you hear about and all the issues there that have everybody so up in arms because they're using chemicals, and it's not just a pressure thing, or even in the old days they dynamited wells. They put dynamite in the bottom of a well, and that breaks open a lot of fractures and can really affect the amount of flow that you might have in your well water. I don't believe they do that anymore. They might, but that's not something I'm involved in. So as far as well construction questions, there are a bunch, but I'll just, what's the maximum depth for a drilled well? Well, it really depends on your location because it's based on geology. You can, in one area, what might seem deep, in Champaign County where I live, 300 or 400 feet is a deep well, but in the Chicago area, there's a deep sandstone aquifer that's at about 1,500 feet that we see in certain parts of the area up there where there's private wells. We see people who have to drill 1,600-foot wells, and that's an extreme. It really does just depend on your area and where your water source might be. In California, before the drought, there were a lot of wells that were 200 to 400 feet deep. Most of those have gone dry, and a lot of them are now being replaced with 700-foot wells because they've lowered the aquifer that far because they've had such a drought going back, 8 or 10 years. So it depends on where you live. And the thing I'd recommend is if you Google your state name and then water well log, you'll find out if your state has that information available. I know in Illinois, our state geological survey puts all the water wells on a GIS site. You can hop on there and it's a map. You can zoom into your area. All the wells show up. You can click on a well and you can see the depth of every well near you. And it's all public information. California has a similar thing. You can map it, or you can pick a location and you can look up all the wells that are nearby and see what depths they are. I just helped a well owner in California last week, and I walked her through that site to show them, they were actually going to buy a home with a well, and you could see all the other wells nearby and how deep they are. So it's really, it just depends on where you live for the first two questions. And where are wells usually on a property? Hopefully opposite from your septic system, other side of the house. but it really, sometimes you can drill anywhere and hit water if there's a big aquifer underneath you. Like, you know, I mean, you're going to use it. It's going to be the same well depth-wise and how it's constructed, whether it's on the northeast corner of your property or the southwest corner of your property. So there is no rhyme or reason there. It's for convenience. It's also to stay away from any sources and following all those setbacks that I showed earlier that you have to do, and also staying away from your neighbor's property. Because you might have a 75-foot setback from your septic tank, but if your well is only 5 feet from your property boundary, then you also have to know where your neighbor's septic is in order not to put your well too close to theirs. And so, I mentioned the example where the well's down on the bottom near the river or the stream. Sometimes you can only get water in certain places. And so there's no real answer to that as far as it's going to depend on the situation. As far as the last one here, I think I've already answered that. You don't want really any trees nearby. We had a case in Virginia where they had a PVC well, and they contacted me and said, well, we've got this problem. We keep testing our well for coliform and it comes back positive, but we've disinfected it several times and there's nothing near the well. So I asked them to send me a picture, and there was nothing near the well but an 18-inch diameter tree about 2 feet away. And so what ended up happening is the roots made their way over to the well and got around the casing, and eventually then as those roots grew, they squeezed that casing and cracked it. And so bacteria were able to get in through the cracks in the casing because there was a really big tree right next to the well. And so that's just a bad thing to do. It probably wouldn't have happened if it were a metal casing, but it's also a lot more expensive. And if they would have not put a tree there or put their well further away from the tree, if it was already there, those things wouldn't have happened. So shock chlorination, always get a lot of questions about that. You should only disinfect or chlorinate your well as far as shock chlorination to kill bacteria when you've sampled first and there's bacteria there. We see all kinds of people who want to pour a cup of bleach down their well every month or something like that, and that does no good. Unless you follow a protocol where you actually mix the water so all the well water has chlorine in it, and then you pump it through all the lines in your house, every toilet, every shower, every sink, and you let it sit and have contact time to kill the bacteria that might be in your system, you're not going to get rid of the bacteria that are in there. And so this guide from Minnesota Department of Health, you can get it on our website. I showed you those resources for lessons 1 and 2. If you go down to lesson 10, this document's one of those. It's step-by-step instructions on how to shock chlorinate your well. And that's what we recommend people follow. So there's a lot of reasons. You don't mix straight bleach. You don't put straight bleach in there. You mix it first based on the size of your well and the amount of water in it, because it's an oxidant and it can release metals from your pump or your piping, or if you're in bedrock, from the rock itself. And now you're releasing a bunch of metals into your water that might be harmful. So how do we chlorinate our well, and would that reduce the amount of magnesium that causes our water to have black specks? Okay, so I'm pretty sure the black specks are probably manganese, not magnesium. Typically what we see is when you have the red staining, it's iron. When it's black staining, it's magnesium. It's manganese. But if you've got something different that shows you have high magnesium, I'd like to see your sample results if you're interested in sharing. You can email our info, or you'll get an email about 2 hours after this webinar that's from me, my email address, and you're free to email me that information. But if you have iron and manganese problems, it's really the same. You can oxidize it and then filter it, which if you use chlorine, it is an oxidant, so it will oxidize the metals, and that precipitates out as iron oxide or manganese dioxide, and then you can filter that out. There's other approaches you can take too, and I'll give an example later. But the advantage of chlorine, if you add continuous chlorination like communities do to their water, is that it also will eliminate any bacteria issues you could have. And so, sometimes A lot of people don't want to do that because they don't like the taste of chlorine. And it depends on how it's being put into your system, at what level. You really just want a little bit of a chlorine residual to get through your lines to make sure that you're killing any bacteria that might be there. Another option, instead of chlorination, if you're considering continuously trying to kill bacteria anyway, would be UV, ultraviolet light. I'm not an expert on UV, and so I can't answer a lot of questions there, but they're pretty common these days in residential homes as far as a way to kill bacteria and treat water that may be close to a source. Or if you're on, there's people who are on springs and those always have bacteria in them, and so you can put in a UV unit and it will kill and inactivate all the bacteria and other things as well. So what's the best way to remove iron from well water? Well, again, one, iron's not considered unhealthy, where manganese can be now, but it certainly causes iron staining, and there's actually a lot of questions about that this time. And so what happens is it's in solution in the water, the iron is, and when it hits air, it reacts and forms iron dioxide, which is the brown sediment that stains everything. So the thing to do is to oxidize it and then filter it. But if it's not a very bad problem, you might just have a sediment filter to start with. It removes anything, any solids down to 5 microns. And if the iron's already oxidized, it'll remove that. It's just a filter cartridge you have to replace every so often, depending on how much iron you might have. But if it's worse than that, then your softener also will remove some iron. You can actually buy softeners that are meant to remove iron, and follow the directions on how to use those. There's also cases where that isn't enough, and or if you don't want soft water, you may not want to use a softener, then you can get an iron treatment filter, which isn't just a filter that's removing stuff that's already oxidized, but it actually involves oxidizing it first to form that precipitate, the iron dioxide that you can take out then with the filter. IDPH has a nice document on that. If you just Google iron in drinking water, it's near the top. So I also wanted to show you that sometimes even that's not enough. So this is a situation in Illinois where if you look at the lower left, that's what a filter looks like that's new in this cartridge. It's a woven 5 micron filter, and the picture right above that is before we took the old one out, and that's the old one in the middle. So this is an area that, for whatever reason, has a particularly high amount of iron in the groundwater, and this is a really rare case, but they could change that filter out about every 3 or 4 days, and so that's not economical per se. And if you look at the stuff there, that's just iron dioxide and gunk. There's some manganese in that too, and a few other things, but it's mostly because of iron. And this is just, I told the well owner here it's just bad luck because their groundwater is just poor quality, and that happens sometimes. And so they've added an actual treatment unit, which is what's on the diagram on the right, to remove iron. And it still has issues with clogging, and because there's just so much iron in their water. And it's I don't know what else to say there. It's an ongoing issue that we're working with, because it's just there's a real problem with their well water as far as being able to use it and not have that iron get through their system and actually clog their pipes. Sulfur. So we also get a lot of questions about sulfur. So the smell is hydrogen sulfide, and it's usually caused. It can be natural reactions in the bedrock, breakdown of material, of organic material can cause it, but typically it's from sulfate-reducing bacteria. And so what happens is there's sulfate in your water. There's bacteria that can start growing, and they're ubiquitous in groundwater. You can't really do anything to get rid of them per se, except you can treat for them to knock them down and minimize the amount you have. But it's usually those sulfate-reducing bacteria, when they they use sulfate as an energy source, and then the hydrogen sulfide is the byproduct from that. And really the best way is to try to kill the bacteria in the well using chlorination, and that or in the water that's coming out, but then because it'll come back typically, but then the chlorine also will oxidize the gas and eliminate that odor. And so you probably need a continuous chlorination type of treatment system. The other thing you can do is use I'm not sure I said it here, I'd talk about layered slime and biofilms. Usually you find them with iron bacteria, not always. But yeah, you can, by adding chlorines, can precipitate all the iron and manganese. And so once you're doing that, you also have to filter, otherwise you're going to have a mess. But as far as the other approach would be to aerate, and I didn't list that here, but some folks have a separate tank they pump their water into that's has a free surface, so there's air in it, and so it's not under pressure like your pressure tank is. And then they have a vent off of that that goes to the outside, and that'll vent off all that gas. People do the same thing for methane. If they have methane in their water, when you bring the water up, the methane comes out of solution, and you can vent it off. And then you pump from that tank into your pressure tank after the water's been aerated, and all that should be gone. I'm not an expert on those things. You should talk to a treatment professional or a contractor that installs home systems to find out more about that. But it's a very common problem to have that issue. And again, sulfate reducing bacteria are about everywhere, and sulfate's pretty common in groundwater. I think we had a question from someone who said their sulfate was 17. That's actually pretty low. I mean, the health standard is 250. And so, but if there's sulfate there, you're going to have, eventually you're probably going to have sulfate reducing bacteria involved. Should I test for VOCs or herbicides and pesticides? Well, these things are really expensive to test for, and there's so many of them that, what we really recommend is that you don't test for those unless you have a reason to suspect that you might have that issue. If you know there's a tank, underground tank that's been there for 50 years near your well, or if you're near a source, or those things, you might consider it, but you also need to consider your well and the geology. And if it's properly constructed and sealed, then you're probably not getting water near the surface, which would be, near the surface is where this would be coming from. And so it's likely not an issue. As an example, you are in a subdivision, but it backs up to a farm field. Your well's only 10 feet from the field. You're concerned that you might be getting pesticides. Well, if you have a newly constructed well and it's properly grouted, and it's not an area that's going to flood, and the well's 200 feet deep and it's in a sand and gravel, in a sand and gravel well, water only comes in at the screen, and the screen's at the bottom. And so it's very unlikely that you'd have an issue. So the factors really are well construction, well depth, and the local geology. If you're in a karst area, for instance, where there's sinkholes, then you can have surface contamination at any depth, because it's a series of large fractures and caves and those sorts of things. So you need to understand your situation. But going back to the annual nitrate and coliform sampling, you test for those because they're cheap and easy to test for. If you have elevated nitrate or you have coliform in your well, then that means your well's vulnerable to surface contaminants. Rarely would we find a pesticide in a well that doesn't also include a higher nitrate or coliform. Just because if one can get in your well, so can the others, and they're ubiquitous in their environment, they're everywhere. And so if you're testing for nitrate and coliform every year and they're always coming back, nitrate has a background level of around 3 milligrams per liter. The health standard's 10. As long as you're down near the background level and you don't have coliform bacteria, then it's likely your well isn't being influenced from surface sources like pesticides, or there was a livestock question, so I threw that here too. Same for livestock. It's not going to affect your well unless surface contaminants can get in your well. So It really depends on your well type, again, well construction, and how properly sealed it is at the surface and those things. How can I find out if the pipes that transport water from our well to our home have lead in them? Well, so that's the line from your house to your home. It really depends. What I said here basically is you can look at the line coming in. If it's in your basement or crawl space, it's likely the same pipe running all the way to your well. And so if you know what that pipe is, if it's PVC, then it's going to be PVC all the way. If it's something else, I would take a pocket knife and scrape a little bit and see if it's lead. But you might want to have somebody else do that for you. If you can't see it though, then I'd contact the person who drilled it. And when you drill a well, some drillers are full service. They drill the well, they install the pump, they put in your pressure tank and the whole system inside. Some just do the well drilling, and there's a different contractor that comes in and installs the pump or does all the home stuff. So in some states there's rules that require different people to do different things. Some it doesn't matter. So I would talk to those folks if you know who they are, and hopefully they would be able to tell you. But if your well is really new, your home is new, then you're likely not going to have an issue. But if it's an older home, then there's no way to know without either seeing the pipe or finding someone that knows what was installed. We see a lot of older homes, especially before the 60s, that have galvanized lines even in the home, and maybe that's just in our area. But the other thing you can do is just test for lead. So collect a water sample, first draw out of your kitchen tap, and if it's been sitting in your pipes overnight, if you don't have lead pipes in your house, because it could be either then. But we do have a webinar. That's what I put a little screenshot there at the bottom. I'd watch that webinar on lead. We had Dr. Kelsey Piper, who has done a lot of research looking at lead in homes with private wells. And there's a lot of good information there. And I would go through that first. It'll give you a better insight as to what your concerns might be. And then the thing I do want to mention is, everybody's heard about Flint. So Flint has always had lead pipes, but they didn't have a problem until they switched their water source. And that's because the water they were using before, they were treating it and making it so that it wasn't corrosive. And when you don't have corrosive water, you're not leaching lead from your pipes. So there's a lot of people who have lead pipes that do not have any risk of lead in their drinking water because their water's not the right chemistry to actually leach lead out of the pipes. And in those cases, usually it's there's a fine line between corrosion and scale formation. So if your water's corrosive or aggressive, it may be leaching lead from the inside. If it's on the other end, it may actually be forming scale on the inside of your pipes. I know we have a program here called the Institutional Water Treatment Program, where we go out and sample state of Illinois facilities like prisons and homes, veterans places and things like that, or even state buildings. We're trying to keep their water right in that happy medium between being corrosive and being scale forming, because both cause problems. One, the scale forming is more of an issue of, having pipes that become clogged, if you will, versus on the corrosion side, that's obviously a risk if they're copper pipes or lead pipes, or have lead solder that you're looking at causing water quality and health issues. So there's a lot to understand, but testing your water for lead is certainly something you should do anyway, especially if you don't have PVC through your home, just to understand probably lead and copper, if you have copper pipes, just to understand if that's going to be an issue for you. So we have had blue water for over 2 years, and every test for copper and other contaminants comes back negative. We've had a couple of water, there's another house nearby, but not near their home. I have not ever come across this, but I'd be really interested in seeing your sampling results. If you're willing to send those to us, again, you'll get my email in a couple hours after this is over. There's folks we can ask. that I work with who are a lot smarter than I am, and even a picture of the water would help, because things like this. Yours is blue water. We had one with another colored water, or some, the thing with the iron recently. We get a lot of interesting questions that are we haven't run across before, and so we put more minds to it, and we can hopefully help figure out what it is. Yeah, and I'm glad to do that if you're willing to share the information with us. Just reach out to me. You can also look me up on the U of I, the University of Illinois website. Just look up Steve Wilson, you'll find me, and you can email me there or call me at that number. So I'd be glad to discuss it further with you, though. I want to talk about this really quick. It's a great resource. So again, Minnesota Department of Health, they have this home water treatment booklet or manual or resource. And if you just Google MN home water treatment, you'll get right to this. It lists those three labels, NSF, Water Quality Association, and UL that I mentioned. And it walks you through a lot of information about water treatment and what they're supposed to do. So this tells you the type of, if it's ion. I used this a few months ago in another webinar where the question was about nitrate, manganese, and arsenic specifically. And so you can see which treat for which, whether it's RO or anion exchange, which, your softener is an exchange media, right? It's replacing, it's taking out the hardness and replacing it with sodium ions when you use sodium salt in your softener. And so it's making your water softer by taking out the hardness. But then for each one of those, it talks about what they are and how they work, what the pros and cons are. It's a really nice document that it does a lot more justice to what your concerns are related to treatment. And so I, again, went through this for nitrate, manganese, and nitrate, or an arsenic. But yeah, it's available on their website. And so, yeah. So what's the best way to test your water? So this is important because if you take it from an outside tap, like an outside spigot or a hydrant that's near your well, you're likely getting well water or natural groundwater. Matter of fact, we tell people to run that for 20 minutes or 10 minutes at least before you actually collect a sample outside, because then we know we're getting water that hasn't even been sitting in the well. It's actually coming right from the aquifer because your well volume has probably already been depleted. And so it's water that's coming back in your well from the groundwater. And that should be the second thing you do. Because first you should test at your kitchen tap. But we recommend testing in both places because one, the outside tap is representative of the groundwater. And so you understand what your natural groundwater is in the area. Your kitchen tap is representative of what you're drinking because it's different, because you've got treatment devices, you've got piping, all those things can change the chemistry. And I'm gonna show you an example. And even sitting overnight, if you do have aggressive water and you have copper pipes, you could have some blue staining that's actually because of copper. I've never seen blue that wasn't because of copper, so this is that question was really interesting. So here's a sample where this is from outside. There's sodium, some things that are highlighted are the important things to talk about. So this is natural groundwater. The sodium's 25.9, it's turbid, it's got a lot of color to it, the pH is 8, and the hardness is 351. Okay, this is groundwater here in Champaign County. They have a filter and a softener, and they had that for years, and so their softener is replacing sodium with the hardness, right? So now all of a sudden their water they're drinking has a sodium level of 198 milligrams per liter. If you're a really big water drinker and you're on a low sodium diet, you may be drinking water that's blowing that for you. And so it's an unintended consequence, but the filter and the softener are doing their jobs. The hardness is now 0.68 when it was 351. The turbidity and color are down to more normal quote levels, but it's increased the sodium quite a bit. All the less than symbols on this means they're below detection limit for our lab. So like for aluminum, it says it's less than 37. That's the detection limit in micrograms per liter. It's a pretty low number. And there's no arsenic. So then they added an RO unit at their kitchen tap. And so now all of a sudden, RO takes out most things. And the thing to understand is it doesn't take out everything. You can't put an RO unit on your system and say, okay, now my water's safe. It's just not a fact. It's a membrane. It removes large molecules. If something is a small molecule, like small organic molecules, they can get through. So it's reduced the sodium to 6.24 from 198. We see a lot more less than symbols because it's taken out a lot of other things. And the thing I always note about this is it actually lowered the pH to 6.23. So our groundwater is typically above 7 pH, which is neutral. And so it's a little more basic. So it's not corrosive. It's not acidic. But by taking all the stuff out that buffers the water, now all of a sudden the pH is below 7. That's not really very acidic, but it's a little bit acidic. Depending on what your source water is, it could make it even lower. And this is also an argument for not having a whole house RO unit unless you need it, because it will change the water quality going through your pipes, where you may have water that actually would form scale or didn't leach lead or copper. You run it after the RO unit, it may do those things. And the 6.23 isn't to say it will. You know, the measure of corrosion or aggressiveness of the water isn't just based on pH, but it's something to consider. So this is meant to be an example of where you sample matters. And if you have the wherewithal or you're interested, collecting both samples really gives you an indication of what kind of water quality you have. You know, if you're drinking out of your hose in your house, especially if you're on a farm, I grew up on a farm, I drink out of a hose. I'm still here, but not that that's a good reason, because those things certainly do have biofilms in them if they sit out all the time. But yeah, it's interesting how this all works and how the chemistry can change from one spot in your system to another. And so it's just something to be aware of. Well water versus water utility. Is well water better than water supplied by utility due to more resolved minerals, or would I need an RO system? So yeah, there's really a lot to talk about here. My dad was this way, by the way. He swore our dug well was better because it was groundwater, natural groundwater, and not, didn't have chemicals in it and all that stuff I think I mentioned earlier. But to say that well water is always better than utility water is not true, plain and simple. Certain mineralogy certainly tastes better. Mineralogy is different everywhere. You may have groundwater that just tastes really good. You may have groundwater that you want to add a filter to because you're trying to remove some of that taste. I have a colleague here who lives out in the country just south of Champaign. They added a filter to their kitchen tap because they didn't like the taste of their natural groundwater. There's no other, they don't need to treat it for anything else, but they did that just because they didn't like the taste. And both of them grew up on a farm and on well water. So, some people don't want any chlorine taste. I get that. So they don't want to add chlorine, but you can, to me, the two questions you've asked here don't have a lot to do with each other. An RO unit, again, doesn't remove everything. The best example of that I have is, two things. There is equipment out there that you can add minerals back into your water after RO because it removes so much of that the water has no taste. And if you've ever drank distilled water, it's kind of interesting because really you can't taste it, and at least I can't. And so natural groundwater, again, has a unique taste no matter where it's at. But arsenic exists in two forms. There's a +3 form and the +5 form. The +5 is more oxidized. An RO unit removes the +5 but does not remove the +3. So depending on what type of arsenic you have, and speciating arsenic at a lab, there's a lot of labs that can't even do it. The thing to do is to oxidize your water first, and then you're sure all the arsenic's been converted to 5, and then an RO unit will take care of it. So you can't count on RO to remove all the arsenic necessarily, unless you have other things in place in front of it, which a lot of times you do. You usually have a filter in front of it because you don't want anything in the water that isn't going to flow through to clog it up quicker and those sorts of things. But every aquifer and groundwater source has different water quality, and that's true even vertically. So where I'm at in Champaign County, We have a shallower sand that's called the Glassford Aquifer, and then the Muhammad Aquifer that's also sand and gravel. And then when you get to bedrock, there's another aquifer that's in the bedrock that's potable water, and you could get water there. All three of those have different chemistry. They're different units. They were deposited at different times. The sand and gravels were both deposited by glaciers, and that's stuff that was ground up all the way up to Canada and brought down here and deposited. And so you can't, there's no blanket statement on water tasting better or worse in any given groundwater source. And that's just, you're used to yours. And so you think it tastes the best. I would have swore by our well water as well, even though I knew it wasn't. I learned it after I got to college that it wasn't safe to drink. Okay, so where can I affordably test my well water? Use a certified lab is a short answer. And that's just to ensure that they've gone through the hoops that you need to go through to show that they actually know what they're doing and those sorts of things. Your state drinking water agency has a list of labs that are certified by them to test public water supplies in your state. Most of those labs will also do private well samples, and so you can find one that's close to you. There's also services. We don't endorse anybody, but we worked with one such service for our Pledge to Test campaign. You can sign up online. They send you the kits. They send it to a certified lab, and then you get your results by email. It's pretty handy in that respect. But again, it's really, I would make sure that whoever you go to is using a certified lab in that way. And there is a list. And like most states list labs that are in their state as well as labs that are in other states. Because the way shipping is today and all that stuff, we have labs that may be 2 states away that can do your sample and meet all the time criteria and ship it overnight and all that stuff. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be in your state. But if you want to use a lab that's close by, there's probably 1 or 2 of those as well. Yeah. I think this is hopefully the last question. If you purchase a property that has a treatment system, how can you tell if it's in good condition? So have it inspected as part of it. And then also you should test the water. You can, like I just showed on that last example, if you test the water before the device and after the device, you should see a difference in the constituents that you're trying to remove based on the device. And so, it was really obvious, for instance, in the last example that I showed those sampling results, that the RO unit was doing its job, right? Because it took out almost everything and changed a lot of the chemistry. And so I talked to the former owner about the maintenance they did, if they replaced, whatever kind of a device it might be, if they maintained it, did they let it sit for a long time? Ask what you should know about that device, and then try to get the original owner's manual information from them as well. And then you can always contact a treatment vendor and ask them about it. And find out if it's in working order. Testing is really the way to know if it's still working, for sure. Okay, so we're going to go move on to, it's almost 3. I'm going long here. So I'm going to go to, let me pull this over. Get full screen here. Okay, so according to the internet, the 7th most common element crust is magnesium. Arsenic is listed to me in the top 10. That might be, I got that from a geologist, so I apologize. That's what I've always been led to believe. I'll admit that I'm a civil engineer, not a geologist, and so I might have been told that and just been perpetuating that lie all this time because I use that comment a lot. I will find out where I got that from and try to, I know it's not in writing, but there we go. Thanks for the correction. Maybe mention about hand sanitizer and antibacterial soaps as far as pumping them out more frequent. I assume you're talking about a septic system here, but I'm not sure. Yeah, what we've been told by septic folks is that normal use of soap and shampoo and those things aren't enough to cause any real permanent damage. It's when you start throwing in a lot of extra things that shouldn't go through your septic that it's a problem. And I get hand sanitizer and antibacterial soaps are antibacterial, if you will. Our understanding is that it's not enough of a use to really affect your septic tank. So that's my understanding. But if, yeah. Okay, will the slides be available later? Yes, and it is being recorded. All of our podcasts, all of our webinars are recorded, and they usually go up 3 or 4 days after the event. And we our info at privatewellclass.org, which is at the bottom of this list. When I get to it, you can email that address and we'll send you the slides as a PDF. What are all the tests I should test for when buying a house? Okay, I've already talked about that, I think, so I'm going to skip that. Can you tell me what a sediment filter does? Well, it filters out particles that are larger than 5 microns, like a 5-micron sediment filter, because groundwater, especially in some cases, it's not all liquid, if you will. There's tiny particles in it, and they come through the screen, or they're, a bedrock well, it's open hole, so it's open to the rock itself. You can have scale buildup or chemical reactions that cause solids to form, and so a sediment filter removes all that. So for instance, I don't show it here, but in some of our videos, you'll see a cloth white filter right next to a totally black cloth filter. And this particular well owner it's all iron and manganese, and he has to replace it almost every month because as the water comes up and it runs through the pump, it gets in contact with air, and it ends up oxidizing that iron and manganese, and those solids then are pulled out before they can get into your line to get in, to come out of your taps. And so, yeah, they're just common practice. Some folks have never even thought about putting a sediment filter on, but you do have sediment in wells, or that builds up in your lines, or yeah, it's just a natural occurrence. Solids form. The water inside your well has a free surface, so there's a air-water interface in your well, and so that can cause some reactions to occur. And we have some of our monitoring wells we have to pump out every few years because they just get iron crud in the bottom of them, just because they're open to air at the top of the well. Colorant blue was being used in a retention pond to discourage algae. Blue color was showing up in nearby wells. Blue color was light blue due to high dilution. Retention pond was lined with clay, and blue color disappears. Thank you for that information. And that's certainly an interesting possibility, which we should share. Hopefully that well owner is still on the call, and yeah, if they're near a golf course or have their own pond, or in a subdivision with a retention pond, that very well could be what's going on. So yeah, I've not run into that before, but we can certainly look into it. Thank you. Okay, so that's all the questions we have for today. Again, if you're looking for CEs, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org, and we will send you that information. The video will be out probably early next week, and the handouts that were listed, I probably forgot to mention that there's 3 handouts on the handouts tab that you can download as well for today, which I forgot to mention at the beginning. But you can email us, and if you have any further questions, please let us know. Thank you for your time today.